Alright, good morning. Let's get rolling with this. Alright, so our next installment of very boring videos that Coach Haberman makes you listen to is going to be about this early part of the 19th century. We're going to talk about Industrial Revolution, this conservative reaction to the French Revolution and Napoleon's reign, and then a little bit about the revolutions of 1830, 1848, kind of sprinkled in here. One thing I want to do before we start with all that stuff is I want to jump back and just cover this empire period under Napoleon, because this is essentially, along with the Enlightenment and obviously the French Revolution too, but the Congress of Vienna that happens in 1814, 1815 is really important, and you really have to understand. Basically everything that happens in the 1900s is a result of one or two things. It's either one, the French Revolution / Napoleon, or the Industrial Revolution. And so, understanding how we get to 1815 is really important, and making sure that you understand, Napoleon fights this grand war against everybody, and he ends up losing because the continental system fails, and he invades Russia in the winter, which is a no-no. And so they convene this Congress of Vienna in order to try to counteract the changes that had happened. And so that's going to be really important. And actually, in fact, let's just kind of I'll jump around a little bit here. So let's just talk about political stuff right away, okay? So this Congress of Vienna, remember, is led by Austrian Prime Minister Metternich. This Congress is going to try to restore the balance of power, so they don't want any one country to be so much stronger than the rest of them that essentially they can do what Napoleon just did. They wanted to ensure that legitimate people were in power, so a good example is the Bourbon Restoration. They didn't want any sort of chumps there. They wanted all royal families that had dynastic bloodlines, all that kind of stuff. They also wanted to restore traditional institutions of power, so you're talking about asserting the place of nobles, and especially the church too. Out of this Congress of Vienna, they're going to create the Congress system, which was between England, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and they essentially decide that they're going to meet up periodically, and they try to meet every year to try to talk out their problems, so they wouldn't fight big wars anymore. And I guess this is the first significant attempt at collective security, international cooperation. This Congress system is basically the precursor to a League of Nations or United Nations, where people come together and talk out their problems instead of just fighting. This conservative system is going to be really successful in preventing the spread of liberalism and nationalism to some extent, all the way up to the revolutions of 1848 when Metternich has to flee. And it's mostly I would say that it's pretty successful in the short run, as far as its two goals were to create peace and restore the old Europe. And it's probably less successful at restoring old Europe, but it certainly does create peace. There's going to be very little war, and really the only wars that really come about is the Crimean War and then the conflicts that have to do with German unification. And so maybe it's not as successful with preventing nationalism and liberalism from spreading, at least in the long run. But it is in the short term, and then it definitely creates this sort of century of peace. A lot of times historians will talk about the long 19th century is basically from 1815 to 1914. And you have roughly 100 years of mostly peaceful times, so that's relevant. All right, we're going to jump back. Okay, so social stuff that's going to happen during this early 1800s period. Napoleon's going to help one of the biggest effects of Napoleon is that he's going to spread the Napoleonic Code, and that Napoleonic Code essentially is the embodiment of liberal ideas about people's natural rights and people's place in society, and that people were created free and equal, and that like everyone had like rights that government couldn't take away. So there's a lot going on there with like the social ramifications of if you're legally equal, well, what about social equality too? And so like there's going to be some, especially amongst young people, a push for more social and political equality as there is legal equality to some extent. Um, Conservatism and nationalism is going to conservatism is going to try to put down nationalism, but we're going to see like nationalistic uprisings in Spain, Italy, Russia, um, and almost Germany. So like you're going to see nationalism really start to sprout, and I think you could even tie this into Napoleon's reign too, because like specifically in Spain, remember we got like Goya's famous painting where you got like the French soldiers gunning down the Spanish soldiers. So like they're reacting to French oppression in Spain because Napoleon put his brother in power in Spain. And then like the thing that Napoleon does for nationalism in Germany is he reorganizes the German states into bigger like political units. And so like that reorganization of those states brings like a greater awareness of like who Germans are and like the fact that they're being run by a Frenchman. And so like not only does like I think there's some things that Napoleon does specifically for that, but I also think that like just the fact that there's a Frenchman ruling these countries like makes also like increases the nationalism too. We're going to start to see industrialization and urbanization start to slowly develop. And that's the biggest thing to remember, guys, that this is a slow process, okay? And it's kind of dependent on where you're talking about. So like once you get to 1850, it really takes off in a much more widespread basis. Before 1850, industrialization and urbanization had largely been confined to like big cities in England, for example, like Manchester, but then just big cities broadly, right? So the Londons, the Paris, like those types of cities are going to be the first cities that kind of feel the effects of industrialization and this sort of overcrowding and urbanization. Now, overcrowding is going to have the effects of suburbs developing, and eventually they're going to have to restructure cities, but that really doesn't happen until the second half of the 1800s. So like the famous examples of cities being restructured in the late 1800s is that like Paris gets so overpopulated and so uncontrollable that they basically like tear down huge parts of it and like redesign the city to basically be able to better control poor people. They also do a lot of the same stuff in Vienna. You're in these cities, you're going to see, and we'll talk about the restructuring of the cities in the next PowerPoint, but you're also going to see in these cities massive outbreaks of cholera, which is you get from drinking bad water. But I think like that's like you're not going to really see in any kind of significant way the government really responding to these problems again until like I kind of told you guys to think about it this way is like this first period of industrialization is slow, but it's important because the people that are industrializing and urbanizing are largely feeling the negative effects of this, and that because government is slow to respond to these changes, much of this wave of like industrialization is not very good for the working class. You're also going to have like some sort of class warfare start. Like Luddites were a group that wanted to get rid of machines and thought machines were going to destroy society. You have the growth of socialism in the early 1800s. In communism, like Marx is going to write the Communist Manifesto in 1840s. You're going to have the growth of trade unions or labor unions and be the first groups that start to push for better treatment of workers. So because with the population growth, like families are going to grow, but because you have more urban environment, like like the urban environment has way less, or creates way more opportunities, I'll say it in a positive way, it creates way more opportunities for kids to be more independent from their family. They can move out, they can move away. Obviously, we're going to see a lot of kids working in factories, so like the family structure becomes less sort of glued together. And then the big thing is like education spreads. So like in 1833, all French towns started having primary schools, and then like compulsory education is going to spread through the rest of Europe, even though it had spread to some countries already by this point. All right, let's talk a little bit about England. Okay, so when we talk about political reforms in England during this early 19th century, it's really important because remember, there's going to be revolutions in 1830 and 1848, and the British avoid both of these sort of waves of revolution largely because they had passed, and I think the key here is that, like, don't overstate this, and that's the reason why I put this chart on here, is that like even when they passed this sort of famous 1832 reform bill, I mean essentially what they do is they add a percent to the electoral reforms, okay? And so now they are going to, like the Reform Bill of 1832 is going to be followed by like the Factory Act of 1833, the Poor Laws in 1834, and then they repeal the Corn Laws in 1840s. So like there are going to be significant improvements to like working conditions for English workers, child labor laws, all that kind of stuff is like that. It's not just electoral. I guess what I don't want to do is just have you say like, oh, they didn't make any reforms. Don't say that. So like they make reforms. It's just slow and they're modest. Like there's no sort of like revolutionary point in the 19th century for England where it's like, oh, suddenly like England really flipped the switch here. Well, no, it's just like gradual improvements in the living conditions and working conditions and growth of people that could participate in politics. Is modest and moderate like growth throughout this time. But understand that that's really important. Like the English sort of slowly but surely work their way towards actually having democracy to some extent. All right, so, and then we'll talk about like the reforms in the late 1800s that like then basically from 1884 to World War I, and by World War I you have like all men that are voting. So, and remember the biggest thing that was holding people back here is that voting had been tied to land ownership. Okay, so just kind of know that. Some of these other things, I guess I will mention these, so just so that you have a frame of reference for this. So, the Sadler Commission was that commission that the government put on to like figure out how bad life was for the poor in England, and that's like they called a bunch of workers in to testify before Parliament and basically tell how their life was going, and like everyone kind of came in and said like, well, we go and we spend 16 hours or 18 hours a day in the mines, and we're always sick and life sucks, and they're like, well, that's not very fun. The other things that, like these Corn Laws and Peterloo Massacre, like the Corn Laws were part of the like continental system, and like essentially said that English people and English businesses had to buy corn and agricultural products from either England or English colonies, which made food more expensive, which poor people weren't really happy about that, but it definitely helped the English economy. And then the Peterloo Massacre was like Peterloo, there was some protests going on, the government went in and just killed everybody, so hooray for that. All right, let's talk about revolutions of 1830, 1848, okay? So the revolutions of 1830 are more mild, but are really important for kind of setting the stage for the revolutions of 1848, because you got to understand, the revolutions of 1830, many of these people that become leaders in this revolutions of 1830 are younger at this point, and so by the time that it gets to 1848, you're like have these kids that were kind of, and I say kids, young people that were leading these revolution attempts in 1830 that were largely unsuccessful. Well, in 1848 they become adults, and they're older, and wiser. And even in 1848, where you could argue that a lot of these revolutions in 1848 aren't totally successful either. Um, the revolutions of 1848 definitely are a turning point in the sense that like uh, basically this whole second half of the 19th century is going to basically deal with the ramifications of these revolutions. So like the things that we need to know about the revolutions of 1830 is that like Charles X, who was a Bourbon, he tried to reimpose absolutism in France. The French people are like, yeah, no thanks. And so Louis Philippe, who was known as the bourgeoisie king, uh, he's like this middle class king, and he was supposed to represent middle class business interests and like an economic rule. Now, the extent to which he actually does that, like, because he's going to get booted 18 years later. But it is important that like the French go through another wave of revolutions, because they are like, hey, yeah, we're not going to do this whole absolutism thing. The beginnings of Italian unification start in 1830. So Manzini like starts Young Italy, and they start pushing for Italian freedom from Austria. Now they're going to be violently crushed, but at least like this, the organization and beginning stages of Italian nationalism are going to really start here. Belgium becomes independent. I don't know how relevant that is, but maybe it's a little side note. Now, when we talk about the revolutions of 1848, again, now in 1830 and 1848, like Russia and England don't go through these revolutions. I think this is a good thing for England. It's probably a bad thing for Russia because, again, it doesn't force their government and society to make reforms. I think that England avoids these revolutions because in the 1830s and 40s it had made reforms. So these revolutions of 1848 are going to be kind of like the end of conservatism. So Metternich has to flee Austria. You're going to see the end of serfdom in Austria and Germany. You're going to see universal male suffrage in France, and an attempt at parliamentary government in Germany, even though like it largely gets pushed aside. But like those are big changes. Okay, so like in 1848 you have the end of serfdom in Austria and Germany. Again, universal male suffrage in France, like that's huge. And then parliamentary government, and then at least an attempt at it. And you have like a further attempt to organize Germany into its own country, along with Italy to some extent. And so let's just talk about France here. So Louis Philippe is going to be forced to abdicate. The Second French Republic is formed. And this is important because it's like basically like a socialist overthrow of the government. And what they tried to do was like set up like a semi-socialistic state. They set up like national workshops, so like basically everybody was put to work. They established 10-hour work days, and even that was considered good. Like a 10-hour workday was awesome. And then they abolished the death penalty. They also abolished slavery in their colonies again. Then what the problem is that like this government, the socialistic government, is going to be overthrown by because of like a conflict between the people that had money, this bourgeoisie, middle and upper class, and these lower classes. And like what ends up happening is that the working class people tried to like shut off like the poor parts of town, and they like basically tried to like start a revolution in the poor parts of town again. And this is essentially why Paris gets organized. They basically bulldoze a bunch of these like poor parts of towns and create very wide streets and avenues, boulevards, whatever you want to call them. So that like they're basically social control, because like it was really hard for the army to get into these very tight parts of Paris and like be able to crush these revolutionaries. But they eventually do. And then there's election in 1848, and they elect Louis Napoleon, which again is like Napoleon's grandson. And so he becomes the president. And then a couple years later, Louis Napoleon declares himself Emperor Napoleon III, and then you have the Second French Empire. which that's going to last. So Napoleon III is going to last in power until the Franco-Prussian War, which, like, Napoleon III actually does a lot of really good, like, social reforms for France. The problem is that, like, his foreign policy is terrible, and so, like, his foreign policy being terrible leads to Bismarck coming to France and basically overthrowing his government. Um, if we look at sort of other ramifications from the revolutions of 1848, and so, like, in Italy, the attempt to reorganize this revolutionary movement and push for Italian unification is going to fail. But again, like, this is all, like, important because it kind of puts in motion the mechanisms and groups and people are going to start becoming leaders that will eventually unify Italy, like Mazzini, Garibaldi, are two important leaders in that. In Austria, remember we talked about this in class, how, like, Austria has a whole bunch of nationalistic groups in it, and so, like, nationalism is really bad for Austria. And so, like, eventually the Habsburgs are going to be restored in Austria, but, like, from 1848 on, it's going to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, like, that's important. It kind of shows the effects of this sort of fractured nationalistic state. In Germany, you're going to see an attempt at a constitutional monarchy. So remember the Frankfurt Parliament in 1848, they get together and they say, like, let's offer King Frederick William to be our king of this newly unified Germany. We'll have this sort of constitutional parliamentary. They're basically trying to create, like, the English system. The problem is that the Prussian King Frederick William is basically like, yeah, I don't want to do that. So, and because Austria is kind of in chaos, and then when the Habsburgs are restored, they don't support it, and because Prussia doesn't support it, this, like, attempt at this Frankfurt Parliament to unify all German states together is eventually going to fail. But again, this is all just kind of important because eventually, I mean, like, within the next 30 years, like, Germany is going to be unified, okay? And so, like, this really is an important sort of catalyst for that. When we talk about religious changes in this early 1800 period, I think that you start to have this, like, difference between the enlightened deistic religion of intellectuals, and then you have, like, the religion of this, like, romantic culture that rejects Enlightenment thought. One of the things that I didn't put on here that I should have is, like, during this early 1800s period, like, Methodism, for example, spreads pretty widely. And so, like, you do have, like, Romanticism in this early 1800s period is really going to affect people's religiosity in a positive way. Meaning, like, people are going to kind of go back to church and they're going to sort of re-emphasize religious beliefs and religion, and that, like, this whole idea that, like this deistic God where, like, he doesn't interact with people and he doesn't interact with the world and that he's removed from this. Like, the Romantics basically reject all that, and they believe in a loving personal God that you can find sort of relationships with. And, like, the best thing, like, the Romantics are going to essentially argue that, like, the way that you find God and the way that you commune with God is also through nature, like, that, like, God is always present in all things. And so I think that you do see, like, an increase in religiousness because of Romanticism. However, sort of, like, the general trend now is going to be, like, decreasing religiosity basically all the way up to the present. I mean, so, like, even though there's kind of this, like, blip on the radar where Romantics are going to stress more and more religion, this is kind of, like I said, a blip on the radar, and we're sort of generally trending towards people becoming overall less religious as a whole. If we talk about other intellectual movements, I mean, obviously we just talked about Romanticism. The other part of Romanticism is they're going to reject Enlightenment not only about religion, but they're going to reject Enlightenment. Like, Enlightenment was all about, like, logical, rational ways of thinking. And essentially, like the Romantics are going to say, like, hey, there's more to life than just like logic and reason. Like humans are humans because we have emotions, we have intuition, we're creative, like we feel and we can communicate that. And so like this, and I think a really good example of that in Romantic literature is Frankenstein. Um, where basically like, hey, like you can't just like make people because there's something special about people. And like Romantics will argue like that's like our spiritual side, like that's what makes us special, and that's what connects us with God, and that's what connects us with all living things in the world. Um, and so like that's one really important difference. The others I think that um, are going to be, they also like help increase nationalism because like Romantics wanted to look to like the medieval period as like being more like heroic, and like where like enlightened thinkers are going to go back to like Greco-Roman philosophers, and like there's going to be like this sort of love affair with like thinking and logic and philosophy. Well, Romantics want culture and drama, and so like they try to like revive these like medieval folklores. um, but a lot of these folklores had nationalistic ties. So, like for example, like Grimm's fairy tales in the German states, it's going to help sort of bring German people together. And then like Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame, which again like helped increase French nationalism too. The other thing that Romantics will do is they're going to stress the beauty and importance of nature, and I think that like this is, I mean, it's somewhat as a part of like their whole like view of the world and like the spiritualism of like what they saw in the world, but it's also like a rejection of the Industrial Revolution too. And so I think as the Romantic period sort of goes on and we get closer to the mid 1800s, um, that it becomes more about rejecting the Industrial Revolution, and I think you'll see that in art too. So some of the other intellectual movements, you're going to have liberalism spread basically from this Enlightenment, French Revolution, Napoleon. And it's essentially like the bedrock of liberalism is that all individuals are born with natural rights that governments can't take away. And those are essentially, you have freedom of religion, you have a freedom from persecution, and that every person has like civil rights and liberties to basically get due process. So it's not like you can do whatever you want. But like that you will always be like given the process of the law if you are suspected of doing something wrong. And so liberalism is all about like having constitutions in order to like basically enforce and protect those natural rights that all people have. Um, and I think like one of the sort of core elements of liberalism also is like that whole political equality thing, right? So like if we're all equal in eyes of the law and the law is the king. So like remember, whenever you have a constitution, even if you technically have a king, if you have a constitution, the law is the king. And so like that is important to remember. Like that, I think more than anything, like that psychologically will have an effect on people over time. Marx is going to publish the Communist Manifesto in 1848. I think this is largely a reaction to not only the poor working conditions, but also like the ridiculous distribution of wealth, or on like the uneven nature of it that's going to be caused by industrialization. Now, like we don't really ever like the extent to which Marx's ideas are important in the short run, I don't know. I think like we have obviously the Russian Revolution during World War I that calls itself a Marxist revolution. Now the extent to which it actually is that, I'd be my guest. But like I think like the fact that you have like growing socialist movements, and then you have like Marxist communism becoming more and more popular with lower class people, just shows that like people are really tired of like basically getting crapped on by the industrialized society. And so poor working conditions, poor living conditions, sickness, disease, like all those things are going to be rejected by sort of this growing awareness by the lower class that like, hey, this is not cool. We have utilitarianism grow, and again, I just want to mention this. I don't know if you're going to see this. Utilitarianism is just that like at any given time you should do what's best for the most. So that like, you know, and this is like the whole like ends justify the means thing. Like you can do something bad in order to like benefit the most amount of people. John Stuart Mill is probably the most famous of the liberal political theorists of the 1800s, even though he doesn't write most of his stuff till after 1850. He's going to write about more equal societies and more like equality of women too, which is important. Here's some romantic art. The one on the left, I think, is a good example of like nationalism and the effects of nationalism and romanticism. That's liberty or Lady Liberty leading the people. I think that's from the revolutions of 1830. Most people falsely attribute that to the French Revolution in 1789. It's not that. I'm pretty sure that's from the revolutions of 1830. And then the one to the right is the one that we have in class, and that's like the wanderer above the sea mist. And again, it's just like a great romantic picture of like nature, the powers of nature, and people going out and experiencing nature, all that kind of fun stuff. All right, so last couple slides here. The technological changes during this time period are going to be really important. You may want to jot this chart down just because I think this is a really good sort of comparison of different sort of economic periods. And so like I would say the 1780 to 1840 period is going to be kind of like this first industrial revolution. I would say this 1840 to 1890 period. And really I would say basically this 1840 to World War II is kind of this like second industrial revolution. And then like after World War II you kind of have this like third industrial revolution, and like now they're kind of saying we're entering into this sort of fourth industrial revolution. But knowing how, like why the cutoffs are here, so like 1780 is really important because that's when they create the steam engine, and within 5 years they're manufacturing power looms. Even though those really don't take off until what did we say the other day? It was like the early 1800s. And so during this period, basically from that until 1840s, now I would say that like the important change there, the factory system. The biggest thing that happens in the 1830s is that railroads start spreading. And then like really if you wanted to make a big cutoff with this like industrial period is 1855 or 1856 that I have here, is the Bessemer process is really what like radically changes the use of steel. So like once you hit the Bessemer process is you could quickly and easily make very strong flexible steel, and like steel basically is the foundation piece of all of like modern society. You know, bridges, railroad tracks, skyscrapers. I mean, you talk about even like military technology with like the use of steel. I mean, like being able to have cheap, easy steel is massively important. And so, like basically, you know, from 1850 on, like you have a whole different. Even though railroads had been invented by that time, not until you have cheap, easily made steel can railroads really expand like they will. But some of these other, I mean, these are important changes. I mean, I think the steamboats have kind of like a short-lived burst because of railroads are going to start spreading. And then the cast iron plow in 1837 does have really important effects for helping farm areas that had been considered unfarmable. Other economic changes, if you kind of think about like why does Britain start this industrial revolution? Again, the agricultural revolution starts in Britain, so that's always important to remember. So like this whole putting out system is going to be a result of this agricultural revolution. Britain's going to have a more stable government. They're going to have a stronger middle class from all the trade that they were doing in the 1700s and 1600s. well, really in the 1700s, after the Peace of Utrecht, and they get control of the slave trade in 1713. I think like that increased wealth you could talk about having an effect on like this like growing agricultural revolution, and then the effects of the agricultural revolution going into like the putting out system. You could talk about having like England has way more rivers and running water. So like when these early machines needed running water, they were fortunate enough to be able to have a lot of running water. They were always near water, and there's lots of rivers around. So like getting resources to where they need to was really important. They also were pretty lucky because their coal deposits and iron deposits were like basically right next to each other. So they didn't have to ship the coal to the iron deposit. So it was just made it more efficient. And so like Britain is going to largely like start the Industrial Revolution and well before most other places are. I mean, if you see this this map here, you can see that like the manufacturing industrial areas are really going to be, and I wish they would have done this by years. Well, on this next slide, I show like railroads growth, and I think you'll kind of see like that. But like the industrial areas are largely going to be in this sort of southwest part of Germany, the middle and eastern part of Germany, and then the sort of Netherlands, Belgium, northern France area. But if you look at like why not France or Germany, they had poor infrastructure. France's coal deposits were far from their iron ore deposits, and so it was hard to get resources where you needed to get them, especially because there's not as many rivers and they're more spread out and there's not railroads. And I think like that's the biggest reason why industrialization really starts spreading after 1820, 1830 is because the railroads allow you to get things where you need to get them. The amount of middle class people in France and the French government policies are going to be problematic. The fact that France goes through a couple different waves of revolutions in the 1800s I think is important. You could talk about like why Germany is slow, is because it had too many independent states, too many tariffs and taxes. Now they're going to start getting rid of these. Remember, like the biggest thing one of the biggest changes in German unification is that in 1834 they passed what was called like the Zollerverein, which is like Zollerverein, and that created like a free trade union between all the German states. Which like you remove tariffs essentially. So then again, like if we just kind of talk about this, if you look at these two, well, look at the map here, and so like all of these, the green is railroads by 1850, and I mean even that is surprisingly limited, right? So if you look at the trade networks that were in existence here, it's mainly connecting major cities. I mean, and you could tell the big jump start that England has, and I mean look how much more spider-webbed England is in 1850 than anywhere else in Europe. But then like the growth of railroads after from 1850, all the red is railroads added by 1880. So between 1850 and 1880, the red is the railroads. And I mean the biggest areas that you see it, I mean like look at how much more well-connected Germany and France become. And I think that explains a lot of like the development. You can see how sparse the railroad lines are in Russia, in Austria, even in Italy and Spain to some extent. So, and if you look at this little graph down here, again, it just kind of shows that like world manufacturing is really going to take off in 1830. And again, like a lot of that has to do with the railroads. All right, so that was the last slide. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Roll Tide.